By the time the gavel fell, Josephine Calloway had exactly $11, a wagon nobody else wanted, and a dog who wouldn't stop staring west. She had lost the freight company her father built with his own hands, lost the house above it, lost the name people used to say with respect instead of pity. What she bought that morning, with the last of her money, was 60 acres of cracked scrubland, out past widow's reach, ground so worthless, the auctioneer nearly gave it away for free, and a broken-down army surplus wagon, rotting in a livery yard, its wheels warped, its canvas gone to rags. The men of Sundown Flats laughed behind their hands. Everyone in the territory knew that stretch of desert had swallowed a supply convoy 20 years back, and never given up so much as a buckle. They called her a fool to her face and worse behind her back. She loaded her dog into the wagon bed anyway, and didn't look back once. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Josephine Calloway and her faithful dog Scout. If you've ever been counted out by people who didn't know what you were carrying, or found something worth keeping in a place everyone else had given up on, we'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Stories like this one are for you. We should tell you first that Josephine Calloway had not always been a woman other people pitied. For 11 years, Calloway Freight had been the most trusted outfit between Sundown Flats and the fort 40 miles north, and her father, Thomas Calloway, had built that trust one delivered crate at a time. He was not a rich man, but he was a careful one, and careful men in freight work tend to live long enough to grow old. Josie had grown up in the seat of a wagon before she'd grown up anywhere else. She knew the smell of hot axle grease, and the particular groan a wheel makes right before it needs greasing again. She knew the weight of a rusted iron tool passed hand to hand under a wagon bed, the sound of dry earth crunching steady under a team's hooves, the way canvas smells of old rain long after the rain itself is forgotten. She knew how to read weather in the color of the western sky, how to calm a spooked mule with nothing but a low voice and a steady hand. Her father used to say she had freight in her blood, the way some men have whiskey in theirs, and he meant it as the highest compliment he owned. There was a particular morning, when Josie was no older than 9, that she liked to return to in her memory more than any other. Her father had let her hold the reins alone for the first time, on a straight, easy stretch of road just outside town, and when she'd managed to keep the team steady through a full quarter mile, without his hands ever needing to steady hers, he'd laughed. A big, unguarded laugh she didn't hear from him often, and told her that freight work wasn't really about the goods in the wagon bed at all. It was about being the kind of person other people could trust to deliver what mattered, safely, no matter the distance. She carried that lesson with her longer than she carried almost anything else he ever told her. It was her father who brought home the pup, 6 years before any of this, a scrappy brindle and white cattle dog with one ear that never stood up straight no matter how he willed it to. Thomas had found him half-starved under a supply shed, and couldn't leave him there. Josie named him Scout, after the old army trackers her grandfather used to talk about, and from the first week he slept in the wagon bed like he already understood that was where he belonged. Scout grew into a dog with a nose for trouble before trouble arrived, and a habit of positioning himself between Josie and anything that made him uneasy, without ever once being asked to. He was, in the particular way of dogs raised alongside grief, remarkably attuned to Josie's moods long before she understood them herself. On the evenings she came home from a hard delivery too tired to speak, he would rest his chin heavy on her boot and simply stay there, unmoving, until her breathing slowed. On the rare mornings joy got the better of her. A good contract signed, a fair price paid. He would circle her twice at a run, ears flapping, tail low and wagging in the particular wide sweep he reserved only for the best of days. Thomas used to joke that the dog had appointed himself foreman of the whole operation, and that he answered to Scout's opinion of a client more readily than he answered to his own gut. It was not entirely a joke. Then came the drought of '84, and after it, the debts. 2 bad seasons in a row meant fewer deliveries, and fewer deliveries meant the bank in Sundown Flats, which was to say, the bank owned outright by a hard, immaculate man named Silas Vane, began calling in notes that had once been handshake agreements. Thomas Calloway had never in his life defaulted on so much as a nickel, and it broke something in him to watch his name get spoken of as a debtor. He worked himself past what his heart could carry, trying to freight his way clear of it, and in the spring of 1887, his heart simply stopped, somewhere on the road home, the reins still loose in his hands. Scout was the one who wouldn't leave the wagon that day. He sat beside it through the night, until men from town came to bring it in, and something about the way that dog refused to move told the whole story before anyone said a word. What followed was the part Josie found hardest to speak of, even to herself. Silas Vane held the note on Calloway Freight, and Silas Vane did not believe in mercy as a business practice. He came to the office himself, the week after the funeral, immaculate in his black coat despite the heat, and laid the paperwork on her father's own desk with the careful, unhurried movements of a man who had done this many times before, and felt nothing in particular about doing it again. He told her, not unkindly, that business was business, that grief did not defer a note come due, and that he was certain a woman of her evident capability would land on her feet somewhere. Josie remembered thinking, even through the fog of that terrible week, that he said it the way a man discusses whether he has no power to change, when in fact, he held every card in the room. Within 2 months, the company was seized to cover the debt, the wagons, the contracts, the good name, all of it folded quietly into Vane's growing collection of other people's misfortune. The house went next. Josie found herself standing in a bare room that had been her father's office, holding a single trunk of belongings, with nothing left to her name but a determination she wasn't yet sure what to do with, and a dog who pressed himself against her leg, like he intended to hold her up by sheer will, if it came to that. She remembered running her hand once more over the worn groove in the desk where her father used to rest his elbow while he worked the ledgers, and understanding, with a clarity that frightened her, that Silas Vane would now own that groove, that desk, that whole room, and would likely never once think of it again. She could have left Sundown Flats. Most people expected her to. Instead, she went to the courthouse auction the week the last of Calloway Freight's remaining assets were sold off, because she had heard, almost as a joke, almost as an afterthought, that a parcel of land out past Widow's Reach was going for next to nothing, on account of nobody in their right mind wanting it. We should explain, for those of you who don't know the old stories of that country, exactly why that land carried such a reputation. 20 years before Josie was ever born into freight work, in the autumn of 1867, an army supply convoy of 4 wagons had set out from the rail depot toward the fort, hauling payroll gold, medical stores, and provisions for a hard winter garrison. It never arrived. No wreckage was found along the known trail. No survivors ever surfaced. No bodies either, which was in some ways the strangest part of all. The army search parties combed the country for weeks and came back with nothing but sunburn and a report that blamed the loss on a sandstorm, though plenty of old-timers in Sundown Flats always muttered that a sandstorm doesn't erase 4 wagons, 40 mules, and a full detachment of soldiers without leaving so much as a wheel spoke behind. The convoy became a ghost story told to children and drunks alike, and the stretch of desert where it was thought to have vanished earned the name Widow's Reach, on account of how many searching wives it had made widows of grief long before their husbands were officially declared dead. It was that land, 60 scrubby acres bordering the old Convoy trail, that Josie set her eye on. Alongside it, in the same lot, sat a decommissioned army freight wagon that had been hauled back from some other forgotten errand decades before, and left to rot in the livery yard ever since, a relic nobody wanted, with cracked wheel rims and a frame that had clearly seen harder use than any civilian wagon should. The auctioneer nearly apologized for including it in the sale. Josie bid on both with the $11 she had left in the world, and won them without another soul raising a hand against her. What Josie didn't yet know was that the very wagon she'd bought for scrap price had made that same desert crossing once before, decades ago, and that Scout would be the one to prove it. The laughter followed her out of town. She heard it plainly. The woman who lost her father's freight company buying worthless dirt and a broken wagon nobody else would touch, throwing away her last dollars on ghost story land. Silas Vane himself, watching from the courthouse steps in his pressed black coat, allowed himself a thin smile at the spectacle, the kind of smile a man gives when he believes a matter is already settled in his favor. He had wanted that scrubland folded quietly into his own holdings eventually, for reasons he did not share with the room, and Josie Calloway's foolish little bid amused him more than it troubled him. Let the girl have her dirt, he thought. She'd be begging to sell it back to him within the year. Josie didn't hear any of that as an insult worth answering. She had learned, in the space of a single terrible spring, that the opinions of a town could not fill a stomach or pay a debt, and that the only opinion left worth trusting was the one belonging to the dog walking steady at her side. She hitched what mule she could still afford to the old wagon, loaded her single trunk, and set out for Widow's Reach with Scout riding up front beside her, his nose already lifted toward the horizon, like he'd caught the scent of something the rest of the world had long since stopped looking for. The land, when they reached it, was not much to look at. Flat scrub broken by dry washes, a few stands of scraggly juniper, and the bones of the old Convoy trail still faintly visible if you knew to look, a shallow scar running west into heat shimmer and nothing. Josie set up a modest camp near a rock outcrop that offered at least a sliver of shade, and told herself, with more conviction than she felt, that she would make something of this ground even if it killed her trying. Scout had other ideas from the very first evening. He would not settle. Every dog has its restless nights, but this was different, a low, insistent energy that had him pacing the perimeter of camp with his nose low to the ground, circling back again and again, to a particular dry wash a quarter-mile off, whining at it, the way he used to whine at storms before they broke. Josie chalked it up to strange country and coyote scent the first night. By the third night, when he refused his supper, and sat instead at the edge of that wash, with his ears up, and his whole body taut as a drawn bowstring, she began to wonder if her dog knew something she didn't. On the fourth morning, she followed him. The wash cut deep into old dry earth, walls striped with layers of red and pale stone, and the air down in that cut carried the particular mineral smell of ground that hadn't seen rain in longer than it liked to admit. Scout led her along it with the sure-footed purpose of an animal who had already decided where they were going, pausing now and then to press his nose flat to the earth and draw in long, deliberate breaths, as if reading a page only he could see. He stopped at a place where the bank had partially collapsed, exposing a dark seam of buried wood, and began to dig with a fierce, almost desperate energy, throwing sand back between his legs, whining low in his throat the whole time. Not the sharp, anxious whine of fear, Josie noted, but something closer to longing, the sound a dog makes when it has finally found the thing it spent days searching for. Josie knelt beside him, and brushed away the loose earth with her hands, and felt her heart lurch when her fingers found the unmistakable curve of an iron wagon rim, half swallowed by 60 years of drifting sand, cold and rough, and heavier than anything that size had a right to feel. She sat back on her heels in the growing heat, staring at that rusted iron, and felt the old Convoy story settle over her like a held breath. Every buried wagon in that country was a rumor. This one was real, under her own hands, on land that legally belonged to her. The excavation that followed took the better part of 2 weeks, done mostly by lamplight and early morning before the worst of the heat set in, Josie working with a shovel and her bare hands while Scout stood sentinel over the widening hole, alert to every sound the desert made, ears pricked toward each distant coyote call or shifting stone, as though he'd taken on the job of guarding whatever secret they were uncovering before either of them knew what it was. Some evenings, he lay right at the pit's edge, with his head resting on his paws, watching her work with an intensity that made her laugh, despite the ache in her arms. She had never seen a dog look quite so much like a man keeping vigil. It became clear quickly that this was no isolated wheel. The collapsed bank had preserved, almost perfectly, the remains of a single army freight wagon, driven or dragged into the wash and then buried, deliberately it seemed, under a rockslide that no sandstorm alone could explain. The wood of the wagon bed had gone soft and gray with age, and it crumbled under her shovel like old bread, releasing a smell of ancient pine and dry rot that seemed to carry 60 years of silence with it. Inside the rotted wagon bed, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth, she found a strongbox, its lock long rusted through, and beside it a smaller chest stenciled with a faded medical corps insignia, the paint gone to little more than a ghost of itself. When she finally pried the strongbox open with a tire iron, the hinges shrieking after decades of stillness, Scout did not so much as glance at it. He had gone still and quiet a few feet away, sitting upright with his ears forward, staring instead at the smaller oilcloth bundle, tucked beneath where the medical chest had rested, staring at it the particular way he stared at Josie herself on her hardest days, as though something inside it mattered more than gold ever could. The strongbox held gold coin, army payroll by the look of the minting dates, more money than Josie had seen in her entire life laid out together in one place. The medical chest held bottles long since useless, bandaging gone to dust, and beneath it all, wrapped in oilcloth of its own, and remarkably preserved by the dry desert air, a leather-bound logbook belonging to a Sergeant Elias Marsh, quartermaster of the lost convoy. Scout would not go near the strongbox itself, we should tell you. Gold held no interest for him at all. But the logbook was different. Every time Josie opened it to read by lamplight, he would come and lay his head heavy across her knee, as though he understood, in whatever way dogs understand such things, that the truth inside those water-stained pages mattered more than any coin ever could. The logbook told a story the Army's official report never had, one that named a name Josie recognized immediately, and would soon wish she hadn't. Sergeant Marsh's final entries described a convoy that had not been lost to weather at all, but deliberately misdirected off its known trail by a young civilian guide, contracted to lead them through Widow's Reach, a guide who had accepted a bribe from a group of raiders waiting in ambush further along the false route, and who had vanished from history entirely once the deed was done, his name scrubbed from every surviving Army record. Marsh's final entries, written with a steadying hand even as he described the detachment's desperate retreat and burial of the wagons to keep the payroll from raider hands, gave that guide's name plainly, in ink that had somehow survived 60 years of desert dust: Josiah Vane. Josie read that name 3 times before she let herself believe it. Josiah Vane, grandfather, by every account she could piece together from town memory, of Silas Vane, the very banker who now held half of Sundown Flats in his ledger and had taken her father's company besides. She sat with that knowledge a long while, Scout's head still heavy on her knee, and understood 2 things with sudden, uncomfortable clarity. The first was that she was now, by simple accident of a fool's auction bid, sitting on more army gold than most people in the territory would see in a lifetime. The second was that the man most likely to come after that gold, and after the logbook that would ruin his family's respectable name in the process, was the same man who had already taken everything else from her once before. In the days after the discovery, before word of it ever reached town, Josie found herself reading and rereading Marsh's account by lamplight, piecing together a dead man's final hours with something close to reverence. She learned the names of the men in his detachment, learned that he'd ordered the wagons buried rather than abandoned, specifically so that whoever eventually found them would understand the payroll had been protected, not lost through negligence. She learned that Marsh had died of his wounds 3 days after the burial, some 20 miles from where his men finally struggled into a trading post half mad with thirst, and that his final entry, written in a hand gone shaky but still legible, expressed hope only that someone, someday, would set the record straight. Scout, through all of it, kept his own quiet vigil. He took to sleeping with his back against the trunk where she stored the logbook each night, as though some instinct told him the pages needed guarding as surely as the gold did, and on the nights Josie wept over Marsh's final words, grieving, in some tangled way, both a stranger's death and her own father's. The dog simply stayed pressed against her side until the worst of it passed, offering nothing but his steady, warm weight, and the occasional soft whine that seemed to say she was not carrying this alone. Word of a woman digging up something out at Widow's Reach does not stay quiet in a town the size of Sundown Flats, no matter how carefully you try to keep it. It took less than 3 weeks for the whispers to reach Silas Vane's ears, and less time still for him to understand exactly what kind of trouble had just been unearthed on land he'd let slip through his fingers. The first sign of trouble came a few days before Vane himself ever showed his face. 2 riders passed slow along the edge of Josie's camp at dusk, saying nothing, simply looking long enough to make their purpose plain, and were gone again before she could form a question to call after them. Scout had gone rigid at the sound of their approach, a low growl building in his chest that didn't stop until the hoofbeats faded entirely, and Josie understood, with the particular clarity of someone who had already lost everything once to this man, exactly whose riders they were. She banked her fire low that night, and kept the logbook close, and Scout did not sleep at all, keeping watch at the mouth of the tent until the sky finally grayed toward morning. Silas Vane arrived at Josie's camp on a Sunday afternoon, dressed as immaculately as ever, flanked by 2 hired men who did not bother pretending to be anything other than muscle. He did not waste time on pleasantries. He informed Josie, in the flat, reasonable tone he used for foreclosures, that the auction sale of the land had been improperly conducted, a clerical oversight, he called it, one his lawyers would be happy to correct in court, and that whatever she had found on that ground rightfully belonged to whoever held proper title to it, title he intended to reclaim by whatever means proved necessary. Scout did not growl at Vane's hired men out of fear. He growled the way a dog does when it has already decided a thing is wrong, and is simply waiting to be told it can act on that decision. He planted himself squarely between Josie and the 3 men, low and solid, every line of him saying stay back without a single tooth ever needing to be bared. Vane eyed the animal with distaste, and made no move closer, and one of his hired men shifted his weight uneasily, the way men do when they realize a dog has already decided the shape of the fight before they have. "Call it whatever you like, Mr. Vane," Josie said, keeping one hand loose at Scout's ruff, more to steady herself than to hold him back. "The land was sold fair, in front of half the town, and you stood on those courthouse steps and watched it happen. If your lawyers find a clerical error now, it'll be because you paid them to invent one." Vane's jaw tightened, just slightly, the only crack in his composure. "You're a freight girl playing at treasure, Miss Calloway. This will go easier for you if you hand over what you found and let men who understand these matters handle the rest." "I understand plenty," Josie answered. "I understand that Sergeant Marsh wrote down the name of the guide, who led his convoy into that ambush, and got paid for it, and disappeared before the army could ever ask him a single question. I understand that name was Josiah Vane. And I understand you didn't ride all the way out to Widow's Reach on a Sunday because you're worried about a clerical error, Mr. Vane. You're worried about what's written on the pages I'm holding right now." She watched something shift behind his eyes. Not quite fear, but the particular stillness of a man recalculating every move he'd planned to make. He said nothing further, only turned his horse and rode back toward town with his men trailing behind him, and Scout watched them go without once breaking his low, steady stance until the last rider had disappeared over the ridge. "You can dress it up as a clerical oversight," Josie told him, "but we both know what this really is." She did not raise her voice. She had learned that much from her father, that steadiness carries further than shouting ever does. "I've read the logbook, Mr. Vane. Sergeant Elias Marsh wrote it himself, the night before he died, trying to protect that payroll. He named the guide who sold his convoy to raiders and vanished. Josiah Vane, your grandfather." The silence that followed told her everything she needed to know about whether Vane had already suspected as much himself. What followed over the next several days was not a fight settled with fists, though Vane's men made their share of threatening visits to Josie's camp, always finding Scout planted in the doorway of her tent, unmoved, unmovable, guarding without ever once needing to be brave in any way that put him in real danger, because Josie, mindful of what she owed that dog, never let him face down more than a raised voice and a hard stare. The real fight was fought in Sundown Flats itself, where Josie, with the logbook in hand, and the quiet, unshakable testimony of a woman who had nothing left to lose, brought her evidence before the territorial marshal, and anyone in town willing to listen. It was not an easy case to make. Vane was respected, or at least feared into the appearance of respect, and a dead man's logbook against a living banker's word might not have carried the day on its own. Josie stood before the packed town hall with the logbook open in her hands, her voice steady even as her fingers weren't quite, and read Sergeant Marsh's final entries aloud, to a room that had gone utterly silent. The description of the false trail, the ambush that never came because Marsh had grown suspicious in time, the desperate night burial, meant to keep the payroll out of raider hands until help could return. Scout sat at her feet through the whole of it, still and dignified, and more than one person in that room would later say the sight of that steady dog beside her did more to convince them of her honesty than any single page of the logbook could have on its own. But Josie had thought carefully about what else the logbook proved, not just Josiah Vane's betrayal, but the precise, documented fact that Sergeant Marsh had buried that payroll specifically to keep it out of raider hands, meaning it had never actually been lost or abandoned by the army at all, meaning Silas Vane's sudden legal claim to improperly auctioned land was transparently an attempt to seize army property the moment he learned what it was worth. The marshal, unwilling to be caught helping a banker steal from the federal government in broad daylight, sided with Josie without much further debate. Vane's own hired lawyer, reading the writing on the wall, quietly withdrew from the matter within the week. The town's opinion of Josie Calloway turned the way town opinions often do, swiftly, and with very little acknowledgement of how wrong it had been. But turn it did, and turn hard against Vane instead, once word spread of exactly whose grandfather had sold out an army convoy for raider silver. Old debts he'd called in without mercy were suddenly examined by neighbors who no longer felt obligated to look away from his methods. Within 2 months, facing an investigation into decades of his own predatory lending alongside the scandal of his family name, Silas Vane sold his holdings in Sundown Flats at a steep loss and left the territory altogether, a quieter and considerably poorer man than the one who had stood laughing on the courthouse steps. Josie, for her part, did not keep the gold, not in the way the town half expected her to. The army payroll was rightfully the army's, and she returned it through proper channels, though the modest recovery reward she was owed for its return was more money than Calloway Freight had earned in its final 3 struggling years combined. What she kept, and treasured more than any coin, was Sergeant Marsh's logbook itself, and the quiet certainty that her father's name, and her own, no longer belonged to anyone who wished them ill. She used what money she had to settle what remained of her father's old debts to honest men who'd been patient with the Calloway family through hard seasons, and put the rest toward rebuilding a version of Calloway Freight, smaller than before but entirely her own, with no note held over it by any banker in the territory. She bought back her father's old wagon shed from the ruins of Vane's collapsing holdings for a fair price paid to its new, more honest owner, and hung a fresh painted sign above the door bearing her father's name alongside her own. A portion of her recovery reward, quietly and without much fanfare, went toward digging a second well for the family's out past Widow's Reach, who had gone dry the same seasons Josie had, and toward a modest fund at the schoolhouse for children whose fathers had, in one hard year or another, worked themselves past what their hearts could carry. Scout rode beside her on every haul, the way he always had, one ear still refusing to stand up straight, guarding her the same steady way he'd guarded that dry wash full of 60-year-old secrets. He grew old eventually, gray coming into that brindle coat the way it comes to every faithful thing given enough years, but he never once lost the habit of standing sentinel at the wagon's edge, whenever it rested, nose lifted toward whatever horizon Josie meant to cross next, as though there might always be one more thing out there worth finding. Curiosity Bridge. But the real payoff of that discovery wasn't the gold at all. It was what the town learned. Watching a woman everyone had counted out prove exactly what she was worth. The people of Sundown Flats never did stop telling the story, though the way they told it changed considerably over the years. What had once been the tale of a fool who wasted her last dollars on worthless desert became, instead, the story of the woman who found what a whole territory had spent 20 years failing to find, and who did it not through luck alone, but through the simple, stubborn faith of trusting a dog who wouldn't stop staring west. Years later, travelers passing through Sundown Flats on their way to the fort would sometimes ask about the old Convoy trail, having heard some fading version of the tale in a saloon further down the line, and the townsfolk would point them toward a modest freight office with a fresh painted sign, where they might catch a glimpse of a graying cattle dog dozing in a patch of sun by the door, one ear still refusing to stand up straight, and a woman inside keeping ledgers as carefully as her father once had, in a town that had finally learned to measure a person by more than the dirt she was willing to bet everything on. We think often about what gets called worthless before anyone bothers to look closer. A scrap of desert, a broken wagon, a woman the town had already written off. Josephine Calloway's story reminds us that overlooked value has a way of waiting patiently for someone willing to dig, and sometimes it takes nothing more than a loyal dog's nose to point us toward what we'd otherwise walk right past. If you found a hidden piece of history buried in ground everyone else had given up on, would you keep it quietly for yourself, or share it with the people around you? We'd love to hear your answer below. Until next time, stay close.